The glass shattered against the marble floor before Nora Bennett had even taken off her coat. She froze in the doorway of the grand dining hall, watching a maid scramble to pick up the pieces while an old woman in a charcoal dress sat at the head of the table, her spine straight as a blade, her eyes locked on Nora, like she already knew every secret Nora had ever kept. "You dropped it on purpose," the old woman said to the maid, not even raising her voice. "Clean it up and leave us." The maid did not argue. She gathered the shards with shaking hands and disappeared through a side door so fast that Nora barely saw her go. Damon Cole's hand found the small of Nora's back, warm and steady, but she could feel the tension running through his fingers. "Mother," he said, "this is Nora." The old woman did not stand. She did not smile. She simply studied Nora from across the long table, the way a jeweler studies a stone, before deciding if it is real or glass. "Sit," she said. It was not an invitation. It was a command, delivered so calmly that Nora understood at once why the maid's hands had been shaking. Nora sat. The dining hall was larger than the entire restaurant where she worked, with a ceiling painted like a summer sky and candles burning in silver holders, even though the sun had not yet set outside. Everything about the room said money that had existed for generations, money that did not need to explain itself. Nora smoothed her skirt over her knees and reminded herself to breathe. "Nora Bennett," the old woman said, testing the name in her mouth like it tasted wrong. "Damon tells me you work at a diner on the east side." "I do," Nora said. "The Blue Spoon. I've worked there 4 years. A waitress. Yes." The old woman's eyes flicked, just briefly to Damon, and something passed between them that Nora could not read. Then those eyes came back to her, sharp and unblinking. "My name is Victoria Cole," she said. "You may call me Mrs. Cole. Most people do not get the privilege of calling me anything at all, because most people never sit at this table." "Then I suppose I should feel honored," Nora said. She had not meant for it to come out that way, with a small edge of steel underneath the words, but once it was out there was no taking it back. She watched Victoria's face for a reaction, expecting anger, expecting the temperature in the room to drop even further. Instead, for one strange second, something flickered behind the old woman's eyes that almost looked like surprise. "Careful," Damon murmured, so quiet only Nora could hear. But Nora had grown up with 4 older brothers, and a father who thought raised voices solved everything. She had spent 4 years carrying plates through a restaurant full of tired truck drivers and rude businessmen who thought a tip gave them the right to speak to her however they liked. She had learned a long time ago that flinching only invited more of whatever was coming. So she did not flinch now. Victoria folded her hands on the table, rings catching the candlelight. "Tell me, Miss Bennett, do you know what my son does for a living?" "He owns a shipping company," Nora said, "and a few restaurants downtown. That is what he owns on paper." "Mother," Damon said, a warning in his tone. Victoria did not look at him. She kept her gaze fixed on Nora, waiting to see what the girl would do with that half of a truth she had just been handed. Nora's heart was pounding, but she kept her voice level. "I know there's more to it than shipping crates and steak dinners, Mrs. Cole. I'm not a fool. I've seen the men who wait outside in black cars. I've seen the way people go quiet when your son walks into a room. And yet you are still here." "I'm still here." "Why?" The question landed heavier than anything else that had been said so far. Nora glanced at Damon, at the tightness around his jaw, at the way his eyes searched her face like he was afraid of what she might say next. She thought about the first night she had met him, 6 months ago, when he had walked into the Blue Spoon at midnight, looking like a man who had not slept in days, and had ordered black coffee and eggs, and had talked to her for 2 hours, like she was the only interesting person left in the world. "Because he doesn't treat me like I'm something he can order off a menu," Nora said. "He asks me questions, and actually waits to hear the answers. That's rare, Mrs. Cole, rarer than money." The room went silent except for the soft hiss of the candles. Victoria studied her for a long moment, and Nora forced herself to hold that stare, even though every instinct in her body wanted to look away, wanted to shrink down and apologize for taking up space at this table full of old money and old secrets. "You have no idea what you are stepping into," Vittoria finally said. Then explain it to me. I do not explain myself to strangers. I'm not asking you to explain yourself, Nora said. I'm asking you to explain the situation, since apparently I'm sitting in the middle of it whether I understand it or not. A maid entered quietly to refill the water glasses, and the room held its breath around the small clinking sound of the pitcher against crystal. Nora noticed that even the staff moved differently in this house, careful and silent, like they had all learned long ago that the smallest mistake could cost them. Vittoria waited until the maid had gone before she spoke again. My husband built an empire out of nothing, she said. When he died, people believed the empire would crumble, because a woman could not possibly hold together what a man had built. I proved them wrong for 20 years before I handed the reins to my son. Every person who has ever underestimated me is either gone from this city or gone from this world. Do you understand what I am telling you? You're telling me you're dangerous. I am telling you I am necessary. There is a difference, though most people never learn it. Nora felt Damon's hand tighten slightly around hers under the table, a silent plea for her to soften, to yield, to give his mother the deference every other person in this house seemed to give her without question. But something in Nora refused to bend. She had spent her whole life being told to make herself smaller, to keep her opinions folded up neatly, where no one would trip over them, and she was tired, bone-tired of doing it. With respect, Mrs. Cole, Nora said, I grew up watching my mother work 2 jobs to keep the lights on, while my father sat on the couch complaining that the world owed him something. I've been talked down to by drunk men who thought because I brought them their food, I existed to take whatever they wanted to say to me. I am not scared of you because you have money and a big house and men in black cars. I've survived worse without any of that. For a long moment, nobody at the table moved. Then Vittoria Cole laughed. It was not a warm sound. It was short and sharp, almost startled out of her, like something had cracked loose that had been sealed shut for a very long time. Damon's grip on Nora's hand loosened, his shoulders dropping an inch, though his eyes stayed fixed on his mother like he could not quite believe what he was seeing. Well, Vittoria said, wiping the corner of her eye with one knuckle, the laugh already fading back into that same cool composure. It appears my son has finally brought home someone with a spine. Was that in question? Nora asked. Everyone who sits in that chair is in question, Miss Bennet. Every single one. Vittoria's eyes swept over her again, slower this time, less like a jeweler inspecting a stone, and more like a general studying a soldier she had not expected to survive the first battle. Most of them cry before dessert. I don't cry easily. So I see. Before dinner arrived, a tall man in a dark suit stepped into the room and leaned down to whisper something in Vittoria's ear. Nora watched the exchange carefully, noting the way the man's eyes never quite settled on any one place, always scanning the corners of the room, the windows, the doors, like a soldier who had trained himself never to fully relax. Vittoria listened without expression, then gave a small nod, and the man withdrew as quietly as he had come. Business, Damon said under his breath, by way of explanation, though Nora had not asked. Does that happen often? Nora asked. Someone interrupting dinner like that? More often than either of us would like, Vittoria answered before Damon could. You will learn, Miss Bennet, that in this family, dinner is rarely just dinner. There is always something happening beneath the surface, a conversation you are not meant to hear. A decision being made 3 rooms away that will change something you will not understand the shape of until much later. That sounds exhausting. It is. It has been exhausting for 40 years, and I imagine it will remain exhausting until the day I die. Vittoria took a slow sip of wine, which is precisely why I do not have patience for people who cannot handle even a fraction of that weight sitting across from them at a table. I haven't run yet, Nora pointed out. The night is young. Dinner was served a few minutes later, course after course carried in by silent staff who kept their eyes down and their movements quick. Nora ate carefully, aware of every fork she chose, every sip of wine, aware that Vittoria was still watching her from the head of the table, even while pretending to be occupied with her own plate. Damon tried twice to steer the conversation somewhere lighter, asking about a trip he and Nora had taken to the coast, about a new chef at one of his restaurants. But each time Vittoria redirected the conversation back toward Nora, asking sharp, precise questions about her family, her work, her plans. It felt less like a dinner and more like an interrogation dressed up in china and candlelight. "Where are your parents now?" Vittoria asked, halfway through the main course. "My mother passed 2 years ago," Nora said. "My father lives upstate. We don't speak much." "Why not?" "Because he never grew out of blaming other people for his own choices, and I got tired of being one of the people he blamed." Vittoria set down her fork. "That is either wisdom or cruelty. I have not yet decided which." "Maybe it's both," Nora said. "Sometimes the wise choice looks cruel to the person standing on the other side of it." Something shifted in Vittoria's expression then, something Nora could not name, gone as quickly as it appeared. The old woman picked her fork back up and did not ask another question about Nora's father for the rest of the meal. Instead, she turned her attention to the restaurant where Nora worked, asking about the owner, about the hours, about the kind of people who came through the door late at night. Nora answered every question honestly, describing the regulars who tipped in coins counted out from their pockets, the truck drivers who called her by name, the quiet evenings when the diner emptied out and she could finally sit for 5 minutes with a cup of coffee before the next rush came through the door. "You could work anywhere," Vittoria said. "My son could arrange a position for you at any restaurant in this city with a single phone call." "I don't want a position arranged for me," Nora said. "I want to earn what I have." "Even now? Sitting at this table, knowing what you know about this family?" "Especially now," Nora said. "If anything, I want it more. I don't want anyone in this house looking at me one day and thinking I only have what I have because someone handed it to me." Vittoria's eyes lingered on her for a long moment, and Damon, sitting between them, seemed to hold his breath, waiting to see which way the moment would tip. "Good," Vittoria finally said, "because I would have thrown you out of this house myself if you had answered differently." Nora blinked, caught off guard by the sudden approval buried inside the old woman's words, and for the first time all evening she saw something almost like respect flicker across Vittoria's face before it disappeared behind that same unreadable mask. When dinner finally ended, Damon walked Nora out to the car himself, waving off the driver who usually handled the door. The night air outside was cool after the heavy warmth of the dining hall, and Nora realized her hands were trembling only once she was safely seated inside the car, the adrenaline of the evening finally catching up to her all at once. "You survived," Damon said, sliding in beside her, a note of disbelief still coloring his voice. "Barely," Nora admitted. "Your mother is terrifying." "She terrifies everyone." He reached over and laced his fingers through hers. "I have never once seen anyone talk to her the way you did tonight. Not my father's oldest friends. Not the men who run half this city. Nobody. Did I make things worse?" Damon was quiet for a moment, watching the estate shrink behind them through the rear window as the car pulled away down the long gravel drive. "Honestly," he said, "I think you might have done the opposite." Inside the house, Vittoria remained seated at the long table long after the dishes had been cleared, staring at the empty chair where the waitress had sat only minutes before. Her housekeeper, an older woman named Carol, who had worked in this house for nearly 30 years and had seen every kind of guest come and go through those doors, lingered near the entrance, unsure whether to speak. "Ma'am," Carol finally said, "should I have the car follow them home? Just to be certain they arrive safely?" Vittoria did not answer right away. She was thinking about the way the girl's voice had not shaken. Not once. Not even when the whole weight of this family's history had been laid out plainly on the table between them. She was thinking about how long it had been since anyone in this house had dared to look her in the eye and disagree with her. "No," Vittoria finally said. "Have someone look into her instead." "Miss Bennett, ma'am?" "Everything. Her family, her work, her friends, every debt she has ever owed, and every person who has ever owed her one. I want to know exactly who is sitting across from my son at that girl's family holidays before another month passes." Carol nodded and turned to go, but paused at the doorway when Vittoria spoke again, quieter this time, almost to herself. "And Carol." "Yes, ma'am?" "Find out if she has ever backed down from anything in her life. I have a feeling the answer is no, and I intend to prove myself wrong or right." Carol left the room, and Vittoria sat alone in the candlelight a while longer, turning her wine glass slowly by its stem, replaying the sound of that short, sharp laugh that had escaped her without permission, for the first time and longer than she cared to admit. Somewhere across the city, in a small apartment above a laundromat, Nora sat on the edge of her bed still wearing her dinner dress, staring at nothing, wondering if she had just made the bravest decision of her life, or the most foolish one. She did not yet know that Vittoria Cole had already set a plan in motion, one designed to find every crack in her, every weakness, every reason she might eventually run. She did not yet know that the old woman rarely lost. But she also did not know that Vittoria Cole had not laughed like that in nearly 15 years, and that the sound had unsettled the old woman far more than anything Nora had said at that table. Some battles are won with fists. Others are won simply by refusing to look away first. Nora Bennett had no idea she had just won the opening round of a war she did not yet know she was fighting. The black car had been parked outside the Blue Spoon for 3 days straight, before Nora finally said something about it. "Your mother has someone watching me," she told Damon over the phone, keeping her voice low as she wiped down the counter during a slow stretch of the afternoon shift. Dark sedan, tinted windows, same spot across the street every single day. "I know," Damon admitted. "I told her to stop." "Why haven't they stopped then?" "Because when I told her, she looked at me the way she used to look at me when I was 12 years old, and thought I could tell her what to do, simply because I had asked nicely. She said, and I am quoting her exactly, that a woman who cannot survive a little scrutiny has no business surviving in this family at all. So this is a competition now." "With my mother, everything is a competition," Damon said. "The only way to win is to stop caring whether you win." "And what did she say?" "She said mothers do not take orders from their sons, no matter how old the son gets or how much money he makes." Nora almost laughed despite herself. There was something oddly consistent about Vittoria Cole, a woman who apparently did not bend for anyone, not even the man who ran half the empire she had built. "I'm not going to pretend it isn't unsettling," Nora said, "but I also can't say I'm surprised. She basically told me at dinner she was going to look into me." "She's thorough," Damon said. "It's not personal. She did the same thing to every serious relationship my brother ever had, before he moved out west and stopped bringing anyone home at all." "Comforting." "I'm serious, Nora. If it gets to be too much, tell me, and I'll handle it." "I can handle myself," Nora said, and meant it. She hung up the phone a few minutes later, when the dinner rush began rolling through the door, but she found her eyes drifting toward the window more than once that evening, toward the same dark sedan parked exactly where it had been the day before, and the day before that. By the end of the week, the investigation Vittoria had ordered had produced a folder nearly 2 inches thick, sitting now on the desk in her private study. Carol placed it in front of her without a word, and Vittoria opened it slowly, scanning page after page with the same careful attention she gave to everything in her life that mattered. Nora Bennett, 26 years old, no criminal record, no significant debts beyond a modest student loan she had been paying down steadily for 6 years, without missing a single payment. A mother who had died of cancer 2 years earlier, after a long illness that had drained the family's modest savings, and a father who had not contributed a cent toward the medical bills, choosing instead to disappear for months at a time, whenever responsibility came calling. 4 brothers, 3 of whom worked steady jobs and rarely caused trouble, one of whom had a brief record for a bar fight in his early 20s, and had since cleaned himself up entirely. Vittoria read every line twice. The folder also contained photographs, taken from a careful distance over the past several days. One showed Nora carrying a tray of coffee cups through the diner, with a tired but genuine smile on her face. Another showed her crouched on the sidewalk outside her apartment building, helping an elderly neighbor gather groceries that had spilled from a torn paper bag. A third showed her alone on a park bench during what appeared to be a break between shifts, eating a sandwich from home, rather than buying food from a vendor nearby, the small economy of a woman who counted every dollar carefully. Vittoria lingered longest on that last photograph. There was nothing dramatic about it, nothing that would impress anyone looking for evidence of danger or deception. It was simply a young woman eating a modest lunch alone, unaware she was being watched, unaware that an old woman with more money than she could spend in 10 lifetimes was studying the photograph as if it might reveal some hidden truth. There was nothing here that suggested opportunism, no pattern of attaching herself to men with money, no history of manipulation, no red flags of the kind Vittoria had learned to spot instantly after 4 decades of watching people try to worm their way into this family for the wrong reasons. If anything, the folder painted a picture of a young woman who had spent her entire adult life working herself to exhaustion simply to stay afloat, carrying burdens that were never hers to carry alone in the first place. Interesting, Vittoria murmured to herself, closing the folder. "Ma'am?" Carol asked from the doorway. "Set up a situation," Vittoria said. "Something small. I want to see how she responds when the pressure is real, not just words across a dinner table." Carol hesitated. "What kind of situation, ma'am?" "Nothing dangerous," Vittoria said, though her tone made it clear the conversation was not open for debate. "Just enough to see what she is made of, when no one is watching to judge her for it." 2 days later, Nora arrived at the Blue Spoon for her evening shift, to find the restaurant unusually quiet, the owner nowhere in sight, and one of the newer waitresses, a young woman named Ellie, who had only been working there a few months, standing near the back office with tears streaming down her face. "What happened?" Nora asked, dropping her bag behind the counter and crossing the room in a few quick steps. "There's a man out front," Ellie whispered, glancing nervously toward the front windows. "He says I owe him money, that my brother borrowed from him and never paid it back. And if I don't come up with $300 tonight, he's going to make sure everyone in this neighborhood knows my brother is a liar who doesn't pay his debts." Nora's stomach tightened. She had no way of knowing this was a test, no way of knowing that the man waiting outside had been paid handsomely by Vittoria's people to play a role designed entirely to see how Nora would react under pressure. All she knew was that a scared young coworker was standing in front of her, shaking, and that nobody else in the restaurant seemed willing to step outside and deal with the man causing the trouble. "Stay here," Nora said. "Nora, don't." He seemed really angry. "Stay here," Nora repeated, already moving toward the door. "Call the owner. Tell him what's happening." She stepped outside into the cool evening air, and the man waiting by the curb turned to face her, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing an expression carefully designed to look threatening. Nora felt her pulse pick up, but she kept her chin level, and her voice steady when she spoke. "I hear you're looking for someone," she said. "You her sister or something?" the man asked. "I'm her coworker, and I'm telling you that whatever business you think you have with her brother, it has nothing to do with her, and it definitely has nothing to do with this restaurant." "That's not how debts work, sweetheart. Maybe not where you come from," Nora said, "but you're standing outside a restaurant full of witnesses right now, harassing a woman who has never even met you, over money that isn't hers and never was. If you have a problem with her brother, take it up with him. If you touch her, or come back here again, I will personally make sure every police officer who eats breakfast in this diner knows your face by name." The man studied her for a long moment, clearly not expecting the confrontation to go this way. Then, almost reluctantly, he stepped back, muttered something under his breath, and walked off down the street without another word. Nora stood on the sidewalk for a few seconds after he had gone, her hands trembling slightly now that the confrontation was over, before she turned and walked back inside to find Ellie still standing near the office, wide-eyed. "He's gone," Nora said. "You're okay." "How did you do that?" Ellie asked. "You weren't even scared." "I was terrified," Nora admitted. "I just didn't let him see it." What neither of them knew was that the entire exchange had been watched from a car parked half a block away, where one of Vittoria's men sat with a phone pressed to his ear, relaying everything he had just witnessed word for word to the woman waiting on the other end of the line. Vittoria listened without interrupting, sitting in her study with the folders still open on the desk in front of her, and when the report finished, she sat quietly for a long moment before responding. She protected someone who was not even hers to protect, Vittoria finally said, almost to herself. A girl she has known for a few months, over a debt that had nothing to do with her. "Yes, ma'am. And she did not once mention my son's name. or threatened to bring his influence into it. No, ma'am. She handled it entirely on her own. Vittoria closed the folder and set it aside, staring out the window of her study at the gardens below, where the last light of evening was fading behind the trees. She thought of the men who worked for her son, grown men with families and years of loyalty behind them, who still hesitated before stepping into danger, still calculated the cost to themselves before acting. She thought of how rare it was to find someone who moved first and counted the cost later, especially for a stranger who owed her nothing at all. The following week, Vittoria invited Nora to the estate again, this time without Damon present. Nora arrived nervous, unsure what to expect from a private meeting with a woman who terrified nearly everyone who crossed her path, but Vittoria greeted her in the garden rather than the dining hall, seated on a stone bench beneath a wide oak tree, a pot of tea already waiting between two chairs. "Sit," Vittoria said, and this time her voice carried less command and something closer to invitation. Nora sat. "I know about the man outside your restaurant last week," Vittoria said, pouring tea into a delicate cup and passing it across to Nora without further explanation. Nora went still. "How do you know about that?" "Because I arranged it." The words landed like a slap, and Nora set the teacup down harder than she meant to, tea sloshing dangerously close to the rim. "You what?" "I needed to know what you were made of," Vittoria said, unbothered by the anger flashing across Nora's face. "Words are easy, Miss Bennett. Anyone can sit at a dinner table and speak boldly when the only danger is a sharp tongue. I needed to see what you would do when you believed the danger was real, when no one was watching to give you credit for it, when the person in trouble was a stranger who could offer you nothing in return." "That girl was terrified," Nora said, her voice rising. "You frightened an innocent person just to test me." "She was paid generously for her trouble, and informed the moment it was over that the entire situation had been arranged," Vittoria said calmly. "No harm came to her. But you did not know that when you walked outside to face a man twice your size, over a debt that was not yours, for a person you barely knew." Nora sat back, her anger slowly giving way to something more complicated, understanding dawning even as the frustration remained. "You wanted to see if I would run." "I wanted to see if you would care," Vittoria corrected. "Running I could have understood. Cowardice is common, and I hold no particular grudge against people who protect themselves first. But caring, truly caring about someone who has nothing to offer you in return, that is rarer than courage, Miss Bennett. That is the thing I have spent my whole life searching for in the people around my son, and rarely finding." The two women sat in silence for a while, the only sound the wind moving through the leaves overhead, and the soft clink of porcelain, as Vittoria refilled her own cup. "I'm still angry with you," Nora finally said. "I would be disappointed if you were not. But I understand why you did it." "That is more than most people manage," Vittoria said. "Most people simply hate me and leave it at that." Nora almost smiled despite herself, the tension of the moment finally beginning to ease. "Is this the part where you tell me I passed your test?" "This is the part where I tell you the test is never truly over," Vittoria said. "Not in this family, not in this life, but you have earned the right to sit in this garden and drink my tea without a folder full of suspicion sitting between us, and for me, that is no small thing." As the afternoon stretched on, Vittoria found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, simply talking rather than interrogating, telling small stories about the garden, about the oak tree that had been planted the year her husband died, about the years she had spent learning to run an empire that everyone assumed would collapse the moment a woman was left in charge of it. Nora listened, asked careful questions, and offered nothing false in return, and by the time the sun began to dip low behind the trees, something had shifted between them, small and fragile, but real. Neither woman said it aloud, but both of them understood that something had begun to change that afternoon, something neither of them had expected, and neither of them was entirely ready to name. Later that night, back at her small apartment above the laundromat, Nora sat on her bed and called Damon to tell him about the conversation in the garden. She expected him to be angry on her behalf when she described the staged confrontation outside the diner, but instead, he grew quiet on the other end of the line, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried something closer to disbelief than anger. She invited you to the garden, he said. Alone, without me there. Is that strange? Nora, my mother has not sat in that garden with anyone outside this family in over a decade. Not with my father's oldest business partners. Not with the mayor's wife, who tried for years to be her friend. Nobody. Maybe she was just curious. My mother is never just curious, Damon said. She is calculating, always, about everything. If she sat with you in that garden and poured you tea with her own hands, it means something, Nora. It means she has already decided you are worth her time, and my mother does not waste her time on people she plans to send away. Nora lay back against her pillows, staring up at the water-stained ceiling of her small apartment, thinking about the way Vittoria's voice had softened, just slightly, while she spoke about the oak tree planted the year her husband died. She thought about the loneliness she had glimpsed underneath all that armor, and wondered how many years it had taken to build walls that thick, and how much it must have cost the old woman to let even a small crack show. I think she's lonelier than anyone realizes, Nora said quietly. Damon was silent for a long moment. I think you might be the first person to notice that in a very long time. Before Nora left the estate that evening, Vittoria walked her as far as the garden gate, an unusual gesture from a woman who rarely rose from her seat to see anyone off. One more thing, Vittoria said, as Nora reached for the latch. Yes? The men who watch you outside your restaurant will not disappear entirely. Not yet. But you should know, they are no longer there to test you. They are there because you matter now. And people who matter to this family occasionally attract the wrong kind of attention. Nora turned back, a small frown forming. What kind of attention? The kind I would rather explain to you slowly, in my own time, than have you discover suddenly and without warning, Vittoria said. For now, simply know this. You are no longer invisible, Miss Bennett. Whether that is a gift or a burden depends entirely on what happens next. Nora walked to her car that evening, turning those words over in her mind, uncertain whether she should feel comforted or afraid, and she did not yet understand how quickly she would find out which one was the correct answer. What Nora did not yet know was that the rival family who had been watching Damon Cole's every move for months had also noticed the waitress who now spent her afternoons in the Cole family garden and had already begun asking questions of their own, questions far more dangerous than anything Vittoria had arranged. The photograph arrived at the Marchetti estate in a plain envelope, no note attached, just a single image of Nora Bennett laughing in the Cole family garden, teacup in hand, sitting close enough to Vittoria Cole that anyone looking at the picture would understand immediately what it meant. Victor Marchetti studied the photograph for a long time before setting it down on his desk. Who is she? He asked the man standing across from him. A waitress, Damon Cole's girlfriend. Apparently the mother has taken a liking to her, which is unusual, since the old woman doesn't take a liking to anyone. Victor leaned back in his chair, turning the possibilities over in his mind. He had spent 3 years trying to find a weakness in the Cole family, some crack in their armor he could use to shift the balance of power in this city back in his own family's favor, and every attempt had failed. Damon Cole was careful, his men were loyal, and his mother was, by every account Victor had ever heard, untouchable. But a waitress with no protection of her own, no history in this world, no understanding of the danger that came with being close to a family like the Coles, that was something new. That was a door that had never existed before. Find out everything about her, Victor said. Where she lives, where she works, who she loves. I want to know every soft place on this girl before the week is out. And if we find something useful, then we use it, Victor said, tapping one finger against the photograph. Carefully, I don't want a war with the Coles, not yet. I want an opening. A single thread I can pull that makes Damon Cole understand, without a single shot fired, that his empire is not as untouchable as his mother has always believed it to be. The man across from him nodded and left the room, and Victor remained at his desk a while longer, studying the photograph of the laughing waitress, turning over in his mind every way a person's affection could be twisted into a weapon against them without their ever realizing what was happening, until it was far too late. He had learned long ago that the strongest fortress in the world could be brought down not by attacking its walls, but by finding the one person inside who mattered enough to make the people guarding it careless. Meanwhile, across the city, Nora had no idea that her photograph had already traveled into enemy hands. No idea that her simple laugh in a garden had just been turned into a weapon aimed at a family she was only beginning to understand. She spent the following days the way she spent most days, working double shifts at the Blue Spoon, coming home exhausted, falling asleep some nights still in her work clothes. Damon called every evening, sometimes twice, always asking about her day before mentioning anything about his own, and slowly, without either of them fully realizing it, their relationship had settled into something steady and real, something that no longer felt like it might collapse under the weight of everything neither of them had said out loud yet. It was on a Thursday evening, during the final hour of her shift, that everything changed. Nora was clearing a table near the front window when a man she did not recognize slid into the booth across from another customer, close enough that Nora caught the edge of the conversation as she passed. "Tell your boss," the man said quietly, "that we know about the girl now too. Tell him the waitress isn't just his problem anymore." Nora froze mid-step, the tray in her hands suddenly feeling impossibly heavy. She kept her expression neutral and continued walking toward the kitchen, but her mind was racing, replaying the words over and over, trying to understand if she had heard them correctly, trying to decide what to do with information she had never been meant to hear. She called Damon the moment her shift ended, her hands still shaking as she dialed. "Someone was talking about me," she said, the words tumbling out faster than she intended. "In the restaurant, tonight, I heard a man say something about the waitress not being just your problem anymore. Damon, what does that mean?" There was a long silence on the other end of the line, long enough that Nora's stomach dropped even further. "Stay where you are," Damon said finally, his voice tight with a fear she had never heard from him before. "Don't leave the restaurant. I'm sending a car right now." "Damon, you're scaring me." "Good," he said. "I need you to be scared enough to listen to me right now. Please, Nora, just stay put." The car arrived 12 minutes later, and Nora climbed inside to find not Damon waiting for her, but two of his men, both silent and alert, scanning the street in every direction as they pulled away from the curb. They drove her not to her apartment, but directly to the coal estate, where Damon was waiting at the door before the car had even fully stopped, pulling her into his arms the moment she stepped out. "What's happening?" Nora demanded, pulling back to look at his face. "Someone tell me what's happening." Inside, Vittoria was already waiting in the study, standing rather than sitting for once, her composure fraying at the edges in a way Nora had never witnessed. "There is a family in this city, called the Marchettis," Vittoria said, without preamble, once Nora and Damon had joined her. "For years they have wanted what my husband built, and what my son now controls. They have tried business tactics. They have tried political pressure. They have tried, on more than one occasion, tactics I will not describe in detail in front of you. Nothing has worked, because we have given them nothing to hold on to. And now they have me," Nora said quietly, understanding dawning even before Vittoria finished speaking. "Now they believe they have found something," Vittoria corrected. "A person outside this family's usual protections. Someone they believe can be pressured, or threatened in ways they cannot pressure, or threaten my son directly." Nora sank into a chair, her legs suddenly unsteady beneath her. "I never wanted to be part of any of this." "None of us choose the wars we are born into, or the wars we fall into," Vittoria said, and for the first time since Nora had met her, the old woman's voice carried something close to gentleness. "I did not choose this life either, not truly. I married into it at 23 years old, believing I was simply marrying a successful businessman, and by the time I understood the truth of what my husband did, I already loved him too much to leave." "What do they want from me?" Nora asked. "Leverage," Damon said grimly, sitting on the arm of her chair, one hand resting protectively on her shoulder. "They will try to use you against me, either by threatening you directly to force my hand, or by trying to convince you that leaving me is the only way to keep yourself safe." "I keep thinking about my mother," Nora said suddenly, her voice smaller than either of them had heard it before. "She spent her whole life trying to protect us from things she couldn't control either. Sickness, money, my father's disappearing acts. In the end, none of her worrying changed anything. I promised myself after she passed that I wouldn't spend my life the same way, always afraid of what might happen next. This is different, Damon said gently. This isn't the kind of danger you can outwork or outworry. This is danger that requires real protection, not just courage. Would it be, Nora asked quietly, safer, I mean, if I left? The room went silent, and Nora watched Damon's face carefully, bracing herself for an answer she was not sure she wanted to hear. But it was Vittoria who spoke first, crossing the room to stand directly in front of Nora's chair, her expression fierce, in a way Nora had not seen since that very first dinner. No, Vittoria said firmly. Leaving would not make you safer. It would only make you appear weak, and weakness invites exactly the kind of danger you are trying to avoid. The Marchettis do not respect fear, Miss Bennet. They respect strength, and the moment they see you run, they will treat it as confirmation that you were always the easiest way to hurt this family. So what do I do? You stay, Vittoria said. You stay, and you let us protect you properly this time, not with tests and staged confrontations, but with real precautions. And you trust that I did not spend 40 years surviving in this world, only to watch some upstart family from the north side think they can threaten someone under my protection without consequence. Something in the fierceness of Vittoria's words settled something inside Nora that had been shaking since the moment she heard those words in the restaurant. She looked at the old woman standing in front of her, ready to go to war on her behalf, and felt, for the first time, something that went beyond respect. Something closer to gratitude, and something even closer to belonging. Over the following days, the estate transformed around Nora in ways she had never anticipated. Security tightened at every entrance. A car followed her to and from every shift at the Blue Spoon, though this time she understood exactly why. Vittoria insisted she move into one of the estate's guest quarters temporarily, an arrangement Nora resisted at first out of pride, until Damon gently reminded her that pride was a luxury that belonged to people who were not currently being hunted by a rival criminal family. She agreed, reluctantly, and found herself falling into an unfamiliar rhythm within the walls of the Cole estate, evenings spent in the garden with Vittoria, discussing everything from the old woman's early years in this life to Nora's own memories of her mother, mornings spent watching Damon disappear into meetings with the same tense set to his jaw that told her, without words, how seriously he was taking the threat against her. Carol, the longtime housekeeper, took a quiet liking to Nora almost immediately, slipping her extra pastries at breakfast and warning her gently about which floorboards creaked loudest late at night. "You're good for her," Carol told Nora one morning, nodding toward the study where Vittoria could be heard speaking firmly into a phone. "I haven't seen Mrs. Cole this alive in years. Most days she simply runs this house like a machine. Since you arrived," she laughs. Actually laughs, not that short bitter sound she usually makes. "I didn't think I was doing anything differently," Nora said. "That's exactly why it's working," Carol said, and left it at that. Nora also spent hours those first days simply learning the rhythms of a household unlike anything she had ever known, the quiet efficiency of the staff, the careful choreography that kept the estate running smoothly around a family whose business required absolute discretion. She noticed things she had not noticed during her first visit, small details that told a larger story, the reinforced glass in certain windows, the guards who rotated through the property at intervals too precise to be casual, the way every member of the household seemed to know exactly where they were meant to be at any given hour. One evening, nearly a week after the incident at the restaurant, Vittoria found Nora sitting alone on the back terrace, staring out at the darkened gardens, her expression heavy with thoughts she had clearly not shared with anyone. "You are frightened," Vittoria said, settling into the chair beside her without asking permission. "I keep thinking about what would happen if something happened to me because of this," Nora admitted. "Not for my own sake, for Damon. I don't want to be the reason he makes a mistake he can't take back." Vittoria was quiet for a long moment, watching the wind move through the trees at the edge of the property. "When my husband was alive," she finally said, "there were men who threatened me to get to him. Men who believed a frightened wife would convince a powerful man to make foolish decisions. Do you know what I did? What? I made certain those men understood, very clearly, that threatening me only made me more dangerous, not less. Fear is useful only when the person you are frightening allows it to control them. The moment you refuse to be controlled by it, fear becomes nothing more than noise. That's easy to say. It is not easy at all, Vittoria said. It took me years to learn it, and I nearly broke myself learning it. But I am telling you now, so that you do not have to spend as many years as I did discovering it the hard way. Nora looked over at her, at the fierce, weathered strength in the old woman's face, softened now by something that looked almost like tenderness. Why are you helping me like this? A few weeks ago you had men following me and staging fake confrontations to test my character. Because a few weeks ago, I did not yet know if you were worth protecting, Vittoria said simply. Now I know that you are. That distinction matters more than you understand, Miss Bennet. As the two women sat together in the quiet of the evening, neither of them noticed the car idling at the edge of the property, far enough away to avoid detection, close enough for the man inside to snap several photographs of the estate's newly tightened security, information that would be delivered to Victor Marchetti before the night was through, along with a single unsettling detail his men had uncovered that afternoon. The waitress was no longer just staying at the estate as a guest. She had somehow, in a matter of weeks, earned a place close enough to Vittoria Cole herself that the old woman had begun treating her like family, and if there was one thing Victor Marchetti understood clearly about people like Vittoria Cole, it was that nothing frightened them more than watching someone they loved placed in danger. Back on the terrace, unaware of the eyes watching from beyond the property line, Nora finally allowed herself to relax for the first time in days, leaning her head back against the chair and closing her eyes as the night breeze moved through the garden. "Can I ask you something?" she said, without opening her eyes. "You may ask," Vittoria said. "I make no promises about answering. Do you regret it, this life? If you could go back to being 23 years old, knowing everything you know now, would you still marry him?" Vittoria considered the question for a long time, longer than Nora expected, the silence stretching comfortably between them in the dark. "I have asked myself that question more times than I can count," Vittoria finally said, "and the honest answer is that I do not know. I have lost things in this life I can never get back. Friends, years of peace, a husband taken from me far too soon, but I have also gained things I would not trade for any amount of safety. Loyalty that runs deeper than blood. A son I am fiercely proud of, even when he frustrates me beyond measure. And now, it seems, a young woman with more courage than sense, sitting beside me on this terrace, asking questions most people are too afraid to ask me directly." Nora opened her eyes and looked over at her, surprised by the warmth in the old woman's voice. "For what it's worth," Nora said, "I'm glad I asked." "So am I," Vittoria said, and for a moment, in the quiet dark of the garden, the distance between a hardened matriarch and a waitress from the east side felt smaller than either of them had ever expected it could become. He finally had his leverage. He simply had to decide how far he was willing to go to use it. The message arrived at midnight, slipped under the front gate of the Cole estate in a plain white envelope, no stamp, no return address, delivered by hand, and gone before any of the guards patrolling the perimeter had noticed a thing. Damon found it first, and by the time he brought it into the study where Vittoria and Nora were still awake, his face had gone pale in a way Nora had never seen before. "What does it say?" Vittoria asked, already reaching for it. Inside was a single photograph, Nora standing outside the Blue Spoon during her shift the week before, and beneath it, a short typed message with no signature. "Stay away from the Cole family, or the next photograph will be of something you cannot walk away from." Nora's hands went cold as she read it over Vittoria's shoulder. "They're not just watching anymore," Damon said. "They're threatening her directly now." "Yes," Vittoria said, setting the letter down with a calm that Nora found almost more unsettling than panic would have been. "Which tells me Victor Marchetti has grown impatient. Impatience makes men careless." "Careless how?" Nora asked. "Careless enough to make mistakes we can use against them," Vittoria said. "Men who feel time slipping away from them stop thinking clearly. They act on instinct rather than strategy, and instinct always leaves a trail." "What kind of trail?" Nora asked. "The kind that leads directly back to the person responsible," Vittoria said. "Victor Marchetti has spent 3 years trying to find a crack in this family without success." Now that he believes he has found one, he will move quickly, before we have time to close it. Quick decisions are rarely careful ones. So we let him move, Damon said slowly, understanding dawning in his voice. We let him think the crack is still open, and we watch to see exactly how he tries to use it. Precisely, Vittoria said. But first, we deal with the immediate problem. You will not be returning to the Blue Spoon until this is resolved. Nora felt something tighten in her chest, a familiar defensiveness rising up before she could stop it. You don't get to decide that for me. The room went quiet. Damon glanced between the two women, clearly bracing for the kind of clash that had defined their first dinner together months ago. But Vittoria simply studied Nora with an expression that held more patience than Nora expected.
You are right,
Vittoria said. I do not get to decide that for you, but I am asking you to consider it, not because I doubt your courage, which I have already seen proven more than once, but because courage without strategy is simply recklessness, wearing a braver name. Nora exhaled slowly, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. I've worked at that restaurant for 4 years, Mrs. Cole. It's the one thing in my life that's fully mine. If I let them take that from me too, what's left? Nothing is being taken from you, Vittoria said. It is being paused, temporarily, while we remove the threat entirely. There is a difference, though I understand it may not feel that way tonight. Damon crossed the room and knelt beside Nora's chair, taking her hands in his. I know how much that place means to you. I know you've built something there that has nothing to do with me or my family. But please, just for a little while, let us handle this properly. Nora looked between the two of them, the fierce old woman who had gone from testing her to fighting for her, and the man who had never once tried to make her smaller, to fit more easily into his world. And finally, reluctantly, she nodded. A little while, she said. Not forever. Not forever, Vittoria agreed. The following days moved with a tension Nora had never experienced before, the estate humming with quiet urgency as Damon's men worked to trace the origin of the letter. As Vittoria made calls Nora was not invited to overhear, as security around the property doubled and then doubled again. Nora spent her days restless, unaccustomed to stillness after years of constant motion, until Vittoria finally handed her a stack of ledgers one afternoon and asked, almost offhandedly, if she might be willing to help review them. I don't know anything about running a business like this, Nora protested. You know arithmetic, and you know people, Vittoria said. That is more than half of what running any business requires. The rest can be taught. It became, in the days that followed, a strange kind of refuge, sitting across from Vittoria at the long desk in her study, reviewing numbers, asking questions, slowly beginning to understand the legitimate businesses that ran alongside everything else the Cole family managed, restaurants, and shipping contracts, and property holdings that required just as much attention as anything more dangerous. The work gave Nora something she had not realized she was missing, a sense of purpose beyond simply waiting anxiously for danger to pass. She threw herself into the ledgers with the same determination she had once brought to memorizing every regular's order at the Blue Spoon, cross-referencing numbers late into the evening, occasionally catching small errors that had gone unnoticed for months. Damon found her one night asleep at the desk, a half-finished ledger still open beneath her folded arms, and stood in the doorway for a long moment, simply watching her, before gently waking her and walking her to her room. You don't have to prove anything to her, he told her quietly as they walked down the hall. She already believes in you. I know, Nora said. I think I'm trying to prove it to myself. Damon squeezed her hand. For what it's worth, you don't need to prove that either. You're good at this, Vittoria observed one afternoon, watching Nora catch a small discrepancy in one of the restaurant's monthly reports that even the accountant had missed. I've spent 4 years watching a diner owner make the same mistakes over and over, Nora said. You learn things when you're paying attention. Most people do not pay attention, Vittoria said. They exist inside their own lives, without ever truly observing the world moving around them. You are not most people, Miss Bennett. I suspect I noticed that the very first evening you sat at my table. It was during one of these quiet afternoons, a week after the threatening letter had arrived, that Nora finally worked up the courage to ask the question that had been sitting in her chest since that first night in the garden. "Why did you really invite me into this house?" Nora asked. "Not the test at the restaurant. Not the tea in the garden. I mean truly, why did you decide I was worth this much of your time?" Vittoria set down her pen and studied Nora for a long moment before answering. "Because you remind me of myself, before this life hardened me into something else. I was 23, in love with a man whose world I did not fully understand, and terrified every single day that I would not be strong enough to survive it. Nobody protected me, the way I am trying to protect you. My own mother-in-law despised me for the first 5 years of my marriage, convinced I was too soft, too ordinary, to belong in this family. I promised myself, somewhere along the way, that if I ever had the chance to be different than she was, I would take it. You could have just been kind to me from the start," Nora said gently. "Kindness without proof is simply naivety," Vittoria said. "I have been naive exactly once in my life, and it nearly cost me everything. I do not offer trust freely anymore, Miss Bennet, not even to people I want very badly to trust. But once it is given completely. I hope you understand the difference." "I do," Nora said, and meant it. Later that same afternoon, while Vittoria took a call in the next room, Carol lingered near the study doorway, watching Nora organize a stack of papers with quiet efficiency. "You know," Carol said, "in 30 years working in this house, I have never once seen Mrs. Cole hand her private ledgers to anyone outside the family. Not accountants, not lawyers, nobody. I assumed she just needed the extra hands," Nora said. Carol smiled, the kind of small, knowing smile of someone who had watched far more in this house than she ever spoke aloud about. "She has plenty of hands available to her, dear. Trust is a different currency altogether in this family, and it is one she spends far more carefully than money." That evening, as they sat together in the garden after dinner, Vittoria told Nora, for the first time, the full story of her own early years in this family, the young husband who had swept her off her feet with charm and quiet confidence, only for her to discover months into the marriage exactly what kind of empire she had married into. She spoke of the years spent learning to survive in rooms full of men who assumed she was decorative rather than dangerous, of the slow, painful process of proving herself capable, of the husband she had loved fiercely despite everything, and the grief that had never fully faded even decades after his death. "I built walls after he died," Vittoria admitted, "high enough that nothing could get through them. Not grief, not fear, not affection. It was easier that way, safer. I told myself for years that walls were simply the price of survival in this life." "And now?" Nora asked. "Now I have a waitress from the East Side sitting in my garden, asking me questions nobody else has dared to ask in 15 years. And I find, much to my own surprise, that I do not mind the walls coming down quite as much as I expected to." Vittoria reached over and, in a gesture that surprised them both, took Nora's hand briefly in her own. "You have earned more than my trust, Miss Bennet. You have earned my respect, and I do not give that easily, to anyone." Nora felt something warm settle in her chest, something that had nothing to do with romance or fear or danger, something closer to the feeling of finally, after years of carrying everything alone, having someone fiercely, unshakably in her corner. She thought, briefly, of her own mother, of the years spent watching her work herself thin trying to hold their family together without ever once asking for help, and wondered what her mother would have thought of this strange, unexpected family Nora had found her way into, one built on loyalty as fierce as blood, even when it came wrapped in danger she had never asked for. "You've gone quiet," Vittoria observed. "Just thinking about my mother," Nora admitted. "I think she would have liked you, in a strange sort of way. She always respected people who didn't apologize for taking up space." "Then I believe I would have liked her too," Vittoria said softly. But the peace of that evening did not last long. 2 days later, Damon's men intercepted a car parked near the estate's back entrance, and inside, they found a man carrying a second letter, this one far more direct than the first, along with a detailed map of the property's security patterns, information that could only have come from someone with access to the estate itself. The realization hit the household like a blow. Someone inside, someone trusted enough to move freely through the grounds, had been feeding information to the Marchetti family. Vittoria's expression, when Damon delivered the news, went colder than Nora had ever seen it, colder even than that first night at the dinner table. "Gather the staff," Vittoria said quietly. "All of them. Tonight. Mother. Tonight. Damon." Nora watched the transformation happen in front of her. The warmth of the woman she had spent the last week getting to know sliding away, replaced by the formidable matriarch everyone in this world feared for good reason. It was a reminder, sharp and sudden, of exactly how much danger still surrounded them, and exactly how far Vittoria Cole was willing to go to protect the people she had finally allowed herself to care about. As the staff assembled nervously in the main hall that evening, Nora stood beside Vittoria, no longer a guest being tested, but something closer to an ally standing shoulder to shoulder with a woman prepared to root out betrayal from within her own household, whatever the cost. "Someone in this house," Vittoria said, her voice carrying easily through the silent hall, "has been passing information to people who wish this family harm. I intend to find out who, tonight, and when I do, they will understand exactly why people fear this family, and why that fear has always been well earned." Nobody in the room moved. Nobody dared to speak. Vittoria moved slowly down the line of assembled staff, her eyes studying each face in turn, and Nora watched, fascinated despite the tension in the room, as the old woman seemed to read something different in every single person she passed. Some met her gaze steadily, others looked away, but Vittoria did not stop, did not accuse, simply continued her slow walk down the row, letting the silence itself do the work of unraveling nerves. "I built this household on loyalty," Vittoria said, still walking. "Every person in this room has been given work, wages, and in many cases, a home, because I trusted you to protect this family in return. I do not make that offer twice." Near the end of the line stood a younger groundskeeper named Peter, who had joined the estate staff only 4 months earlier, recommended by a distant cousin of one of Damon's business associates. Nora noticed the way his hands trembled slightly at his sides, the way his eyes darted toward the exit more than once, as Vittoria drew closer to where he stood. Vittoria stopped in front of him. "You have been unusually quiet, Peter," she said. "I have nothing to say, ma'am," he answered, his voice thinner than it had been the day before, when Nora had heard him laughing with one of the kitchen staff over breakfast. "Everyone has something to say," Vittoria replied. "The question is simply whether they choose honesty or silence when given the chance." The room held its breath, and Nora felt her own pulse quicken, sensing that whatever happened next would change the shape of everything that followed. And somewhere within those walls, someone who had smiled politely at Nora every single day for the past 2 weeks felt their pulse quicken with the sudden, sickening knowledge that time had finally run out. Peter broke before Vittoria asked a single further question. "Please," he said, his voice cracking, "they threatened my sister. They said if I didn't tell them about the security schedules, about who came and went from this house, they would hurt her. I didn't want any of this, Mrs. Cole. I swear it." The room stayed silent, every member of the staff frozen in place, waiting to see what would happen next. Nora watched Vittoria's face carefully, expecting fury, expecting the kind of coldness that had settled over the old woman only minutes before, but instead, something more complicated passed across Vittoria's features, something almost like recognition. "Who threatened her?" Vittoria asked quietly. "A man named Marchetti. He said he worked for someone important. He showed me a photograph of her outside her apartment to prove they knew exactly where to find her." Vittoria nodded slowly, and when she spoke again, her voice had lost none of its authority, but something in it had softened. "You were afraid for someone you love. I understand that fear better than you know, but you should have come to me the moment they approached you, Peter. Fear handled alone becomes a weapon. Fear shared becomes a problem we can solve together." "I didn't think you would believe me," Peter admitted. "Then that is a failure of this household, not merely yours," Vittoria said. "Damon, see that his sister is brought somewhere safe tonight. Immediately. And see that Peter understands he still has a place here, provided he never makes the mistake of carrying a burden like this alone again." The relief that swept through Peter's face was immediate, and around the room, the tension that had gripped the staff for the past several minutes began to ease as well. Nora watched Vittoria dismiss the household, watched the old woman's shoulders drop slightly once the hall had emptied, the weight of the confrontation finally settling. "You could have punished him," Nora said quietly, once they were alone. "I could have," Vittoria agreed. "But punishing a frightened man for being frightened teaches nothing except that fear is more dangerous to reveal than to hide. I would rather my household trust me enough to bring their fears to my door than hide them until it is too late to help." But the information Peter had shared, however unwillingly, now confirmed something Vittoria had suspected since the letter first arrived. Victor Marchetti was growing desperate, and desperate men made mistakes that could be traced. Within 2 days, Damon's men had confirmed the location of a warehouse on the city's north side, where several of Marchetti's men had been seen meeting regularly, and Vittoria began quietly assembling everything they would need, not for an attack, but for a confrontation designed to end this threat permanently, through leverage rather than violence. She spent hours in her study, reviewing old records, cross-referencing shipping documents that had crossed her desk years earlier, searching for the kind of leverage that could end a conflict without a single act of violence changing hands. Nora watched her work late into the night, impressed by the patience of it, the discipline, the way Vittoria treated this confrontation less like a war and more like a puzzle that simply required the right pieces assembled in the right order. "You could simply frighten him," Nora observed at one point. "I've seen how people react to you." "Fear is a blunt instrument," Vittoria said, not looking up from the papers in front of her. "It works quickly, but it rarely lasts. Leverage, real leverage, changes a man's calculations permanently because it costs him something concrete every time he considers crossing you again. I did not survive 4 decades in this world by relying on fear alone. I survived by making certain the cost of crossing me was always higher than the reward." "I want to be there," Nora said, when Damon explained the plan to her that evening. "Absolutely not," Damon said immediately. "Nora, this is exactly the kind of danger we have been trying to keep you away from." "I'm the reason this started," Nora said. "I'm not going to sit in this house while you and your mother put yourselves at risk trying to end something that began because of me." "It did not begin because of you," Vittoria interjected, entering the room in time to catch the last part of the conversation. "It began because Victor Marchetti has wanted what this family has for years, and finally believed he found a way to take it. You are not the cause, Miss Bennett. You are simply the excuse he has been searching for. Then let me help end it." Vittoria studied her for a long moment, weighing something behind her sharp eyes. "What do you propose?" Nora took a steadying breath. "You said it yourself, that Marchetti believes fear is his strongest weapon. Let him see that it isn't. Let him see me standing beside you and Damon, unafraid, and let him understand exactly how badly his plan has failed." Damon looked ready to argue further, but Vittoria held up a hand, silencing him before he could speak. "She is right," Vittoria said. "Victor's entire strategy rests on the belief that we are protecting a frightened, ordinary woman who will crumble the moment real pressure is applied. If he sees instead a woman standing beside us, without flinching, it dismantles the very foundation of his plan." "Mother, this is not a game." "I am well aware of what this is, Damon," Vittoria said sharply. "I have survived far more of these confrontations than you have been alive to witness. Trust that I would not risk her safety, or yours, without absolute confidence in the outcome." 2 days later, the meeting was arranged, a neutral location chosen by both sides, a warehouse office stripped of the usual comforts of power, nothing but a long table and several chairs beneath a bank of humming fluorescent lights. Victor Marchetti arrived with 3 of his men, expecting, Nora suspected, to find Damon Cole alone, or perhaps accompanied only by his usual guards. Instead, he found Vittoria seated at the head of the table, Damon at her right hand, and Nora seated calmly at her left, her spine straight, her expression unreadable, exactly the way Vittoria had once taught her to hold herself in a room full of people who wanted to see her break. Victor's surprise was brief, quickly masked behind a practiced smile. "Mrs. Cole, I did not expect the whole family to join us. I find that important conversations deserve honesty about who is truly involved," Vittoria said. "You have been threatening a woman under my protection, Victor." I thought it only fair that she hear directly what you intended to say about her. Victor's eyes flicked toward Nora, assessing her the way Vittoria herself had once done at that first dinner months ago, searching for the crack, the flinch, the sign of fear he had been counting on finding. He found none. "Miss Bennett," Victor said smoothly, "I hope you understand this was never personal." "It felt personal when you threatened to photograph something I couldn't walk away from," Nora said, her voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath it. "It felt personal when you frightened a young man into betraying people who had shown him nothing but kindness. I'm not sure what definition of personal you're working with, Mr. Marchetti, but I suspect it's different from mine." A flicker of something crossed Victor's face. Not quite respect, but something closer to recalculation. The visible process of a man realizing his assumptions about a person had been entirely wrong. "You misunderstand my intentions," Victor tried again. "I understand them perfectly," Vittoria cut in, her voice like ice cutting through the warehouse air. "You believed that threatening someone I love would force my son into a position he could not defend. You believed fear would make us careless. Instead, you have shown your hand for nothing, Victor. We know about the warehouse. We know about the men you have positioned near my restaurants this past month. We know considerably more about your operation than you know about ours, which I imagine was never the outcome you intended when you began this campaign." Victor's composure finally cracked, just slightly, his eyes narrowing as he glanced toward his own men, none of whom offered him any reassurance. "What do you want?" he asked finally. "I want you to understand something clearly, so there is no confusion in the future," Vittoria said. "This family does not respond to threats with fear. We respond with resolve. You will call off whatever remains of your campaign against Miss Bennett, against my son, and against this family entirely. In return, I will refrain from sharing what we have learned about certain irregularities in your own shipping manifests with the parties who would find that information most interesting." The silence that followed stretched long and heavy, and Nora watched Victor Marchetti's face carefully as he weighed his options, watched the exact moment he realized he had walked into this meeting, believing himself to hold the advantage, only to discover the advantage had never truly belonged to him at all. "You've made your point," Victor said finally, his voice tight. "Then we understand each other," Vittoria said, rising from her seat, a clear signal that the meeting had ended. "I would strongly advise you never test the patience of this family again, Victor. I do not extend second warnings." They left the warehouse together, Damon's hand tight around Nora's, Vittoria walking a step ahead, with her chin held high, exactly as she had walked into every room Nora had ever seen her enter. Outside, once they were safely in the car and pulling away from the building, Damon finally let out a breath he seemed to have been holding the entire meeting. "You were incredible in there," he told Nora, disbelief and pride mixing together in his voice. "I was terrified," Nora admitted, echoing the words she had said to Ellie weeks earlier, the memory feeling like it belonged to an entirely different lifetime now. "You did not appear terrified," Vittoria said from the front seat, turning to look back at her. "You appeared exactly like someone who belongs in this family." The words settled over Nora like warmth spreading through her chest, and she realized, sitting there in the back of the car with Damon's hand still wrapped around hers, that somewhere over the past several weeks, this had stopped feeling like a world she had stumbled into, and started feeling like a world she genuinely belonged to. In the days that followed the warehouse meeting, word moved quietly through the city that the Marchetti family had withdrawn from every position they had staked out near the Cole family's businesses, that the men once stationed outside the Blue Spoon had vanished entirely, that whatever campaign Victor Marchetti had begun was now, quietly and without ceremony, over. Damon relayed the news to Nora over breakfast one morning, watching relief spread visibly across her face for the first time in weeks. "It's really finished?" "It's finished," he confirmed. "My mother made certain of it." "I still can't quite believe how calm she was in there," Nora said, shaking her head. "I was terrified underneath all that composure, and she looked like she was simply having a difficult business meeting." "That's the thing about my mother," Damon said, smiling faintly. "After enough years in this life, she stopped confusing danger with drama. She handles both the same way, calmly, and with absolute certainty that she will come out the other side standing. I think I understand her a little better now," Nora admitted. In the beginning I thought she was just cold. Now I think she's just been carrying more than anyone around her ever realized. Damon reached across the table and squeezed her hand. She'd never say it directly, but I think you're one of the only people who has ever actually seen that about her. 3 weeks later, life at the estate had begun to settle into something closer to peace. The threat from the Marchetti family had quieted entirely, exactly as Vittoria had promised it would, and Nora had returned to her shifts at the Blue Spoon, though now with the quiet, steady knowledge that she was never truly unprotected. Not anymore. On a warm evening in early autumn, Vittoria hosted another dinner at the long table, where everything had begun, but this time, the candles felt warmer, the silence less sharp, the old woman at the head of the table smiling, actually smiling, as Nora described a particularly chaotic shift at the diner that had ended with a spilled tray of milkshakes and an entire booth of laughing regulars. "You have brought something into this house that has been missing for a very long time," Vittoria said, once the laughter had faded and the staff had cleared the final course. "What's that?" Nora asked. "Life," Vittoria said simply. "This house has been full of power for decades, Miss Bennet. It has rarely been full of life." Damon reached over and took Nora's hand beneath the table, the same way he had done at that very first dinner, though everything about the moment felt entirely different now. "For what it's worth," Nora said, looking at Vittoria with something that had grown, slowly and unexpectedly, into genuine affection. "I think this house found its way into my life just as much as I found my way into it." Vittoria raised her wine glass, a rare, unguarded smile touching the corners of her mouth. "Then let us drink to that, and to the fact that I was wrong about one thing all those months ago." "What were you wrong about?" Nora asked. "I believed no one would ever again earn a seat at this table without fear standing between us," Vittoria said. "You have proven me wrong, Miss Bennet, and I find, much to my own surprise, that I do not mind losing that particular argument at all." Later that night, after the dishes had been cleared, and Damon had walked off to take a call from one of his managers, Nora found herself alone with Vittoria on the terrace once more, the same spot where they had first begun to understand each other weeks earlier. "Can I tell you something?" Nora asked. "Always. When I first walked into this house, I thought surviving dinner would be the hardest part of loving your son. I had no idea it would turn into something so much bigger than that." Vittoria turned to look at her, the moonlight softening the sharp lines of her face. "Love rarely stays the size we expect it to be, Miss Bennet. It grows into rooms we never planned for it to fill." "Is that what this is?" Nora asked quietly. "What's between us now?" "I believe," Vittoria said slowly, choosing her words with the same care she brought to everything, "that somewhere between that first dinner and tonight, you stopped being my son's girlfriend and started being someone I consider family in your own right. I do not say that lightly, and I do not say it to many people." Nora felt her throat tighten, unexpected emotion rising at words she had not realized she needed to hear. "Thank you," she managed, "for all of it. The tests, the tea, the protection, even the parts that frightened me." "Thank you," Vittoria replied, "for refusing to run. Most people, faced with everything you have faced these past months, would have left long ago. You stayed, and in staying, you taught an old woman that trust is still worth extending, even after a lifetime of learning to withhold it." The two women sat together as the night deepened around them, the estate quiet and settled, the danger that had once hung over every conversation finally, truly gone. Outside the grand dining hall, the candles burned steadily against the coming dark, and inside, for the first time in longer than anyone at that table could remember, the house that everyone feared had finally, quietly, become a home.